All right, so back a few months ago, was driving to work, barely awake, going down 45, and I had the Steve Bauer show on my truck. Just barely turned up. Wasn't really paying attention, and then I heard the words family history. I was like, wait a minute. And then I turned it up, and Mr. Robertson was on the Steve Bauer show talking about his book, and told some of his story, and it was real interesting. And first thing I did when I sat down at my desk, before I get my coffee, I bought his book. So, and then I immediately reached that thought, okay, we have to have him in this group. And he was gracious enough a few weeks later to take me into his house, and we talked and had a really good several-hour conversation. I've got deep roots in Hardeman County, and going back to 1821, and so we talked about that, and it was really interesting, and I think you'll really enjoy this program. And I'll stop talking now and introduce Mr. Evelyn Robertson.
Thank you, David, and certainly let me just say good evening to each of you. It's great to be here with you today. I was really encouraged that David reached out to me so quickly after that particular interview with Steve Bowers. And certainly it's great to be here among people who are interested in history and genealogy and so forth. This has been something that's been of interest to me for a while, and certainly putting together this particular research was something that was quite revealing, not only just about my family, but my surroundings, the environment, what have you. And it took a while, but certainly finally I was able to come up with a product. Let me just also say that it's great to be in the midst of some people that I have come in contact with in times past, Roger Giles being one. Certainly good to see you, Roger, and certainly it's good to see Ms. House, whom her husband and I work together at Western Mental Health Institute. And there'll be some information I'm going to share with you pertaining to that as well. Let me just simply say that this particular portrait is not a high five about the Robertson family. It's a humble attempt to create a portrait or a description of an African American family that goes back to the 1860s in Whiteville, in Hardeman County. And I heard someone mention 1830. That was the year that my great-grandmother was born, 1830 in Virginia. Somehow she ended up in Arkansas, and then ultimately in Whiteville. And my grandfather was born in Arkansas. But I'll get into a little bit more of the discussion about this. David was very helpful in putting together a little slideshow opportunity associated with this particular presentation. And I realized that I've got a time frame possibly. So I'm gonna try to work within the time frame, hopefully that I have. But one of the things that I have tried to do, David, you may have to help me with this. Do I just do spacebar? Okay, spacebar. That's Hardeman County there. And of course, as I said, I'm from Hardeman County. That gives you a little bit of an idea of the location, what have you, of where Hardeman County is. Oftentimes people recognize Hardeman County based upon the fact that Western Mental Health Institute is located there. That's in Bolivar, of course. Of course, I live in Whiteville, and certainly I have a relationship with Western Mental Health Institute, which I'm going to share with you as well. But one of the things that I mentioned in this particular book is that I I know that during the era of my grandfather, whom really is the hero of this book. If there's a hero in this particular book, it's Crawford Robertson. And that was my grandfather. He was born in 1856. He was 9 years old before he was emancipated. So I'm standing on his shoulders here this afternoon. And throughout my entire life, I've been standing on his shoulders because of the things that he actually did. But this is a little bit of a location, a little bit of an indication of where Bolivar is and where Whiteville is and so forth. I do know that during this particular era of his life, it took a lot of courage, it took a lot of fortitude, it took a lot of effort to get the Robertson family to where it is today. And some of his accomplishments I'm going to talk a little bit about as well. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you, and this is a quote that's in the book, I submit that we're standing on the promises as penned by R. Kelso Carter in his song, Standing on the Promises. And some of you may be familiar with that particular song, but anyways, one stanza of it goes like this: standing on the promises that cannot fail, when the howling storms of doubt and fears assail, by the living word of God I shall prevail, standing on the promises of God. I know that God's mighty hand has been on this family. No family, of course, is perfect. Circumstances and challenges are ever present. Still, the resilience of this family and this success is a story that I felt should be told. And one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this was because of the fact that this particular story is one that is about my family, but there are numerous other families whom their stories never get told. And I guess I wanted to be able, maybe 50 years from now, 100 years from now, to say that, well, the Robertsons passed this way. And the only way to do that was basically to put something in print, that provided some evidence of it. There are some missing links, there are some pieces that I don't have here. And I'm hoping that my children, my grandchildren, and generations to come will be able to put together and piece together some of the links that maybe I have not been able to ascertain. But this is what I find has happened too often, is that, and I found that many people who grew up in Whiteville and surrounding areas, they accomplished many things and they have a tremendous story to tell. But once the matriarch and the patriarch of those families are passed on, the children did not keep up with what was happening, did not keep it recorded, they pass on. And the story never gets told. So my intent was to try to do something to try to keep that particular story alive and memory alive. What you see here, these are my uncles. The one that's sitting there in the driver's seat, his name is Johnny Robertson, was supposedly one of the first African Americans to own a vehicle in Whiteville. And that's he and my other uncle there, his name is Vivian Robertson. So that's a picture of my two uncles, my father's brothers. This is a picture here of my grandfather, Crawford Robertson, my grandmother, Cora, and my aunt, Myrtle. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about them as we go further into this particular presentation. But it's Crawford Robertson whose shoulders I'm standing on. And it was his particular ingenuity, his vision, and his efforts that he put forth that I found to be really significant, inspiring. And I was talking to Mr. Williams when I first came in. He said, well, you've been to school. Well, I have been to school. My grandfather and my grandmother, they had very little education, but they had the education of hard knocks and experience. And it was through that particular effort that their intellect was very significant, very important as it pertains to the Robertson family. This is a picture of the house that Crawford Robertson built in 1906. And this is just the driveway. The house still exists. As I said, it was built in 1906. And he was one of the carpenters that built this particular home. And I'll get into a little bit more about the home and the other efforts and so forth associated with the property. I live on a farm. The farms have been in my family 135 years. And I own the entirety of the 187 acres. But it was an interesting story as to how it got to be and how it came about. But if you will note, I mentioned that he was 9 years old before he was emancipated. And growing up during that particular period of time was very, very challenging, very interesting in light of the fact that this was right after the Civil War, that he was trying to matriculate through life and through the challenges that life brought to an individual who was born into slavery. So as I think about his particular efforts and the efforts of those around him and those who were similarly affected, it had to be a very challenge to make life significant and important during that particular period of time. So after the war, obviously there was a struggle for identity, and as a result of that, this was something that was an effort that had to be taken into account. Many of you may be familiar with the song, Lift Every Voice and Sing. This is something that many African Americans consider to be a very important song. And a song most African Americans know from school or church, and is often referred to as a Black national anthem. What this song does is depicts the struggle and identity after the Civil War, and even the African American search for identity today. And as a result of that, what this particular song does is tries to portray a social movement, a movement of solidarity. And the first verse opens with a command to optimism, praise, and freedom. And the second verse reminds us to never forget the suffering and the obstacles of the past. The third and final stanza is about the challenges of the future. They are to be met with perseverance, courage, faith, and trust in God. And Lift Every Voice and Sing was written by a gentleman by the name of James Weldon Johnson. And for some of you, you may or may not know this, but James Weldon Johnson went to school in Tennessee. He went to college at Fisk University. And he penned the words to that particular song. And his brother, Robertson Family, put the lyrics to music. So that has a historic tie and connection to this particular song and the struggle and things that were going on in this particular period of time. I want to just mention the fact that the churches played a very important role when it came to the struggle and the efforts to elevate former slaves. And it was through the church, through the ministers, particularly the AME church and also the Baptist churches, played a huge role in making for that to occur. Of course, during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, during the segregation era. Those are just progressive steps to move us to where we are now. Those were challenges that took place during this particular period of time. I would also point out that during after the Reconstruction period, black colleges and universities, HBCUs as they were typically called, Lane College, for example, here in Jackson, Howard University, Tuskegee, Tennessee State University, all of those are colleges and universities that have played a huge role in trying to elevate individuals. And they were typically started in the early 1900s, trying to elevate this particular population. One of the significant characters during this particular period of time was a gentleman by the name of Julius Rosenwald. Some of you may be familiar with Julius Rosenwald, but he was one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck. And through his association with Booker T. Washington, they formed an effort to develop schools for African Americans throughout the South. And 883 schools, I believe, in the South utilized the funds from the Rosenwald Foundation to be able to be started as schoolhouses in the South. And one of those schools was in Whiteville. It was the Allen White School. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But it was through that particular effort that the focus on education was very significant during this particular point in time. So it was the schools, it was the churches. They played a huge role in trying to deal with the identity following the Civil War. This is a picture of my father here. He was a graduate of Tennessee State University. And this is a picture here of the courthouse in Bolivar. And I have an association or relationship to that as well. That's the entrance to the Hardeman County courthouse. Of course, Hardeman County was founded, it was named after Thomas Hardeman. He was the first clerk to serve in Hardeman County, and it was named after him. I had the fortune of serving as a county commissioner in the late 80s and early 90s, representing a district in Whiteville. But the point that I want to focus on now is a little bit about my grandfather. Again, he was one of several children born to Cornelia Robertson. And she, of course, was born in Bolton Toward, Virginia. And in the 1850 census, she was listed as 15 years of age. And the household members were Matthew Robertson, Mary Robertson, John Robertson, and Cornelia, Chastain, and Sarah. And according to the early census information, or according to the early records, it pointed out that she was supposedly married to a gentleman by the name of Henry Neely. That's the person's name that's associated with who my grandfather's father was. My grandfather was from a household of several children. The members included Cornelia, of course, his mother, Monterey, Harriet, Cora, Howell, Bay, Elnora, and of course, Crawford. And I do have a descendant chart, a family chart that I'll show you a little bit later as well. My grandfather also was part of 2 marriage unions. He was married to a lady that was living in this particular area, and he had 2 children by her, Ada and DeWitt. I never met them, and I don't know exactly what happened to his first wife. But later he married my grandmother. Her name was Cora. His first wife's name was Hannah Waddell. And I was able to trace those two children from that particular union to Institute Street here in Jackson, Tennessee. Some of you may be familiar with Institute Street, but I never met them, never knew them. And but they were a part of the household of my grandmother and my grandfather upon their matrimony. To Crawford and Cora, there were seven children were born. And Guy, Johnny, Vivian, Eleanor, Myrtle, and my father, Evelyn Sr. And there was one child that died in infancy. So they were parents of seven children. This is just a picture here of some of the family activities. That's my son on the left. The picture in the center is my daughter when she received her doctorate in Provo, Utah. She was a physical therapist by training, and she has a doctorate in physical therapy. We were in Provo at that particular time. The picture to the right there is me presenting a copy of a book that I co-authored about Western Mental Health Institute to Governor McWhorter. This is on the Western Mental Health Institute grounds, and this is during the time of my superintendency at Western Mental Health Institute. So a little bit more about Crawford. He had a quest for land ownership. There was a gap between the time that he got from Arkansas to Whiteville. I just have to assume that he was a very young person when his mother moved to Whiteville. And I'm sure that he grew up on some plantation, some huge farm at that particular point in time. But it was through his interests that he obviously had a quest for land ownership of his own. And he successfully purchased this farm that I mentioned to you that I live on in three purchases. He made three purchases. The interesting thing about this is that the first purchase was a down payment that he made in 1886. He paid $200 down on 75 acres. And in 1888, he completed that purchase. $532 was the total cost. He paid $200 down in 86, and then he paid the balance in 88. And this was the arrangement with this particular gentleman that he purchased it from was 6% per annum. And it was from a gentleman by the name of W.E. Farley, is who he bought it from. And he was a gentleman who lived in Whiteville. And he purchased the first 75 acres. Then he purchased 12 acres from a fellow by the name of S.E. Vaught, V-A-U-G-H-T. And then he made another purchase of 100.5 acres from a gentleman by the name of Isaac Ken. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Mr. Ken as we progress here further. What you see there is a plaque associated with the National Register of Historic Places. They award plaques to entities, buildings, etc. And the farm that I live on is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is also a century farm, as certified by Middle Tennessee State University. They have a Center for Historic Preservation, and they require documentation, deeds, etc., to verify that the history associated with it. And they also want to know if it has been continuously operated during that particular period of time. which the Robertson farm has been. As I said, it's 135 years old now, but it was, if it's 100 years old, the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State was certified that farm as a century farm. And there's a plaque, a sign, and certificate, and so forth that goes with there as well. So Crawford Robertson was, in my view, a entrepreneur, and he was also a visionary. And he had an excellent reputation as a farmer in this particular area, and as you would imagine, as farms go, they raised some of everything that they ate and what have you, including the farm animals and all the other things that go with feed and so forth, food and so forth. And he utilized this particular efforts to make it productive to meet the needs of his particular family. Anyway, that's a little bit of the family tree associated with my family as well there. I mentioned the fact that this farm is on the National Register, and of course in the book I have copies. I have a picture of the Century Farm Certificate, as well as the Century Farm other identifications associated with this. Not only was my grandfather involved with farming and the other aspects associated with life in this particular area, but he also had a very important interest in his children being educated. During this particular period of time in the early 1900s and up until the mid-20s, if you wanted an education beyond the 8th grade, you had to leave Whiteville to get it. If you looked like me, or looked like my family, there was no place to get a high school education in Hardeman County. So he sent 2 of his children to Nashville, to what is now Tennessee State University. They had a high school there. There was a high school located on that campus. And my uncle, one of those gentlemen you saw in that T-model, and my aunt, they went to Nashville to get their high school education. My father was sent to a little place in Shelby County called Woodstock. The little town is called Lucy, Tennessee. It's near Millington. That's where he got his high school education from. And 3 of his children that he sent away from home to get a high school education, all 3 of those went to college. 2 of them graduated. My father graduated and my aunt graduated. One of the uncles went to Lane College for a period of time, but he didn't graduate. So all 3 at some point matriculated at a college as a result of having to be sent away from home to get a high school education. It was a stretch to be able to do that. There were not many African American parents that were doing that in the early 20s. But he obviously made that particular sacrifice and took advantage of, and they took advantage of the opportunities to be able to get a high school education, and ultimately for 2 of them, a college education. The other thing that happened is as a result of them not being able to go to school beyond the 8th grade in Hardeman County, he had an interest in trying to make a remedy for that. And he played a huge role in the establishment of secondary education in Whiteville. And as a matter of fact, I told you that he was not a learned individual from the standpoint of degrees and diplomas, but obviously he had a lot of common sense, and he had a lot of interest in trying to elevate not only his children, but children in the community. And he, along with several other gentlemen, formed an organization that represented an effort to establish secondary education in Whiteville. He was the treasurer of this board of trustees of what ultimately became the Hardeman County Training School. And he was the treasurer of this particular organization. And in 1929, the school opened as a high school. And because he played a huge role in that, there's a cornerstone in the book with his name on it as the treasurer. Prophet Robertson is the treasurer. Up until 1960, if you were African American, you had, if you lived in Bolivar, if you lived in Grand Junction, if you lived in Middleton, you had to come to Whiteville to get a high school education. That was from 1929 until 1960. And the school was later changed to the Allen White High School, but it initially was a Hardeman County Training School. My aunt taught at that school for 40 years. I worked there. My early career was in education as well. I worked there for 6 years. Served as a teacher, coach, and also principal. When I left there, I was the principal of the elementary school. In 1970, of course, desegregation ensued, and schools were no longer identified by race. And my aunt, along with me and 14 other individuals, were sent to Central High School in Bolivar, Tennessee. That was the beginning of desegregation in Hardeman County in 1970. And she went there. She was a home economics teacher. She taught home economics there for 2 years, and then she retired. I worked there as the vice principal for 4 years, and then I moved on to another particular arena outside of education. But that's how that particular story has unfolded there. I mentioned earlier that the emphasis on education among by my grandparents, and I credit my grandmother with this particular initiative as well. My grandfather died in 1937. That was before I was born. I was born in 41. So I didn't know him. But I did know my grandmother. She died in 1950. So I was able to become very familiar with her. But education has been something that's been emphasized in the Robertson family from its beginning. And I'm proud to say that 4 generations of my family are college graduates. And that's very significant. I had a granddaughter that just graduated from Middle Tennessee State University in November. And my grandson graduated a year before that from the same university. So 4 generations of Robertsons have been able to earn college degrees. Just a little bit about myself. I started out, as I said, as an educator. Had an opportunity to change fields in 1974. I was offered an opportunity to serve as an assistant superintendent at Western Mental Health Institute in Bolivar. And I served in that particular role as an assistant superintendent until '79. And then the state of Tennessee decided that it wanted to establish a separate facility for individuals who were intellectually disabled and mentally ill on that campus. And that particular agency was called the Nat T. Winston Developmental Center. It was a statewide facility serving people from all over the state. It was a 150-bed facility. And I was able to serve in the role of superintendent of that facility and started it up from scratch. And served in that particular role for 4 years. And then in 1983, I was appointed superintendent at Western Mental Health Institute and served in that particular role from Governor McWhorter appointed me as commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation, as it was called then. So I served 4 years under his administration as commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation. And from there, I retired from state government, and I went to work for 1 year as the vice president of behavioral health at West Tennessee Healthcare. And then an opportunity presented itself whereby I was able to take on another role as the executive director of the Southwest Tennessee Development District. And it's located here in Jackson. And I served in that role for 11 years, thus ending a 45-and-a-half-year career. And I've been retired since 2007. I want to focus on a little bit on this particular slide right here. You know, life carries with it some oddities and some things that you just maybe wouldn't expect. And I didn't discover some of these things until I started this particular research. Isaac Ken, merchant, landowner, bank director. Isaac Ken sold my grandfather 100.5 acres. He was one of the founding directors of the Bank of Bolivar. The Bank of Bolivar was the oldest bank in Bolivar, in Hardeman County. He served as a bank director for that bank. I served as a bank director for that bank as well. Now, I didn't discover that until I started gathering information about who Isaac Ken was and the history, his role in Bolivar, Hardeman County. So I found out to be somewhat of an oddity that we had that particular similarities, that particular experience. The bank, I served on the bank board until it was purchased by CB&S Bank. CB&S Bank owns it now. But until that particular sale or merger, I was a member of that bank board of directors. W.C. Farley sold my grandfather that 75 acres, that first 75 acres. He was a merchant, businessman in Whiteville. I don't know what the connection was. You know, I wish I did. I don't know what the relationship was. I don't know how that particular opportunity presented itself where he would make that particular opportunity available for him. But he did. And thus, 135 years later, you know, here we are. I put that Dr. John Robertson up there. I don't have all the connections associated with him. The name Robertson is that's my last name as well. He was a physician, he was a postmaster, he was a large farmer, he had a large farm. I don't know whether that was in a connection with my grandfather or not. I haven't been able to put that particular piece together. Western Mental Health Institute. I've told you about my association there, my relationship with the Western Mental Health Institute. It was, and I co-authored a book called Grains of Sand, which is the history of Western Mental Health Institute. Back in the 80s, Governor Lamar Alexander, when he was governor, he, for the 100th anniversary of the state, maybe it was the 200th anniversary of the state, he launched something called Coming Home to Tennessee. And it was asking state agencies to do something to commemorate this particular significant milestone. So I put together a group of individuals, some staff members at the hospital, and some community individuals. And we wrote a book, Grains of Sand, the history of Western Mental Health Institute. And of course, it sold out very quickly. It's out of print now, but that was something that was done as a part of that. Dr. Evelyn C. He's from Whiteville. He was a physician. He was also the superintendent at Western. He was also the commissioner of mental health. He was also an author. I fit into those same categories. I'm from Whiteville. I was a superintendent at Western. I was a commissioner of mental health. Strange things happen. I mean, I didn't know that until I got into this particular research. And then Allen White School. Allen White School, as I said, was the only school in Hardeman County for African Americans as a high school from 1929 to 1960. And then in 1960, there was a school that was opened up in Bolivar that served African Americans that lived in that part of the county. So there were ultimately 2 high schools at that particular point that served African Americans. And then, of course, desegregation in 1970. All of the identifiable schools by race were eliminated at that particular point. Hardeman County went from 6 high schools to 2. One being Central High School, where I ultimately ended up working along with my aunt, and Middleton High School, which was right on the Mississippi line. Those are the 2 high schools that currently exist in Hardeman County today. This is just some additional pictures here. This is a picture of my wife and my granddaughter. And by the way, this is my wife, Hughlene. I meant to mention this earlier. If we make it to October the 13th, we would have been husband and wife for 58 years. That's me presenting a copy of the book to the Whiteville librarian. And that's my aunt on the right-hand side there, Myrtle Robinson. She worked 42 years as an educator. She taught home economics all the period of time. This is the entrance to Western Mental Health Institute. And that's a picture of my aunt there with my first cousins. Those are my cousins. They grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. That picture was taken there in Whiteville on the farm. And to the right, that's a picture of Jim Sanderson and myself at the inauguration of Governor Ned McWhorter in 1991. This is during his 2nd term as governor. That's the administration that I served in. And we were just leaving the inauguration event. Jim Sanderson was an attorney from Bolivar. And I heard somebody talk about DNA. Well, I've had a DNA test as well. And as you can see, some of my ethnicity estimates there. 29% of my ethnicity estimates are from England, Wales, and Northern Europe. And you may wonder about that, but my grandfather, according to the census records, was listed as a mulatto. So I would assume that explains that. 23% is from Nigeria. And then you see the other percentages. Cameroon, Congo, Southern Bantu peoples, it's like 18%. Mali, Benin, and Togo. There are some Irish there. Ireland and Scotland, 3%. Ghana, 2%. Senegal, 2%. And by the way, my wife and I had a chance to go to South Africa in 2007. And we came back through Senegal. But we spent 7 or 8 days in Johannesburg and Cape Town. But Senegal was a very significant passageway for African Americans to come to this country. So 2% of my ethnicity is Southern, 2% in France, and then you see other percentages are much smaller. Norway, Southern and Eastern Africa, 1%. Germanic Europe, 1%. The Philippines, 1%. So that's my DNA composition. And that's the book, The Robertson Family. And I don't know whether you have any time for any questions or anything of that particular nature, but it's been my pleasure to come and be with you. Thanks to David Mayo for inviting me. And certainly, it's always great to be able to talk about the Robertson family. Thank you very much.